Thank you, Justin and Beatrice as well. It's really a delight to be here. So, loss and damage refers to those aspects of climate change that we can't adapt to and that we haven't mitigated against. So I'm going to talk about two very different kinds of research projects into loss and damage caused by sea level rise, a digital platform called Second Sea, and a study in a coastal community titled Designing Managed Retreat. And it's important to note that all of the work that I'm going to show today is part of a collaborative research project with Professor Sam Jacoby and Ben Mehigan, amongst another group of collaborators at the Royal College of Art here in London. So every project begins with an encounter. Second Sea wouldn't exist without this legal case, and I want to explain why. So about 10 years ago, climate science started establishing more rigorous methods for calculating historical contributions to atmospheric carbon. That research is part of the reason why a Quechua-speaking Peruvian farmer named Saul Luciano Luya came to file a lawsuit against the German energy giant RWE. You can see one of their mines here. Saul lives below a mountain lake that is replenished by glacial meltwater. Global warming accelerates glacial melting. As you know, if the lake overfills, it floods his home. In response, the local government decided that they would build a new dam, and the cost of that dam was $4 million US. So in 2015, Saul's German lawyers filed a suit for damages against the German energy company, alleging that it was responsible for paying 0.47% of the cost of his dam, or $20,000 US, because it was responsible for 0.47% of global historical emissions. So RWE is not really worried about $20,000 US. It's a pittance. But they refuse to settle out of court. Why? Because they're absolutely terrified of the precedent that this case could set. The precedent is that RWE could be liable for 0.47% of all climate-related damages everywhere, because it's responsible for 0.47% of global warming. And not just RWE, but other corporations and states too. So a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation, World Economic Forum estimates suggest around $1.65 trillion worth of damages by 2050. So if RWE is responsible for 0.47% of that, you end up with about $7.75 billion worth of damages. So the case is still in the courts. But it inspired us to make Second Sea, and as a platform created to stimulate debate around global financial reparations. And I think one of the interesting things, and it's not really have time to talk about it today, but is the way that litigation follows just behind science, and the way that, in a way, each substance, for example, aerosols, which is something that I've worked on in the past, but in this case, CO2, produces its own kind of legal reasoning. So we chose to make this project looking at sea level rise rather than fire or drought, for example, just because there is good available data around coastal inundation and good estimates of future loss and damage for coastal cities. So the platform correlates between these two data sets and a third data set around historical contributions to CO2 emissions. You can select one of 132 coastal cities around the world, enter an emissions scenario and a date between now and 2100, and it will give you a total estimate for loss and damage for the city that you've selected. It looks something like this. More provocatively, it says, if current proportions of contribution continue, this is how one would apportion national contribution. In other words, it kind of splits the bill based on responsibility, as per the case I showed. So another way of thinking about that is, if sea levels were to rise by a meter, RWE, the company, would be responsible for 4.7 millimeters of that increase. So Users receive a shareable asset in the form of an invoice. And it was launched on... I might kill the sound if you don't mind, thank you. It was launched on the eve of COP27 in Egypt in English and Arabic versions. We knew that loss and damage was going to be the main agenda item at COP, and so the research was really timed to go live as part of that event. It was designed by a brilliant group of people in London called Accept and Proceed, with coding from another organization called Made by On, and received a really brilliant reception. It was really useful for connecting us to other organizations and to community groups, also looking at sea level rise around the world, and it won an award from Dezeen for Graphic Design of the Year, which I thought was really neat. So Second Sea, you can see it here, produces a really useful, I think, and kind of popular entry point into starting to think about the impacts of sea level rise globally, and a helpful entry point into discussions around financial loss and damage and financial reparations. But it exists in a kind of numerical space, and we know there's a number fatigue when it comes to climate discussions, and so many forms of loss and damage also can't be quantified. Most importantly, for us, it doesn't really touch the ground. It's a kind of desk-based project, and it doesn't really touch the lives of the various communities that are involved. After all, experiences of sea level rise are existential and visceral experiences. So that's the second phase of Second Sea, was really an attempt to start to address those issues, but also because non-economic loss and damage are mainly things that communities feel and experience and understand, rather than things that can be counted easily. And so as a researcher, it becomes less about trying to come up with the right calculation and much more about designing the right process. So this is the team of people that have been working on this project titled Designing Managed Retreat, Coastal Communities in the Green Transition. And we often think about sea level rise or the impacts of climate change potentially more generally as a global south problem. It's not. Second Sea involved a series of walks, workshops, interviews and exercises with local residents of Hornsey and Withensea here in the UK, supported by the AHRC Future Observatory project. And we selected these communities because they live on the fastest eroding coastline in Europe, averaging between 1 and 2 meters a year, rising up to 4.5 meters a year, sometimes losing even 10 meters in a single storm surge. They're managed by these kinds of things, which are called shoreline management plans. And these contours are generational contour lines. Yeah? So they're marked in 25-year increments. And so, for example, people could point to the land and everyone knew where the shoreline would be in 25 years. They knew where the shoreline would be in 50 years. They knew where the shoreline would be in 75 years. So in the UK, there are currently 3 main approaches to rising sea level. The first is referred to as defend the line, and Faye talked about this really eloquently just before. This is effectively building things like seawalls or hard engineering works. The cost of these things is around £5,000 per metre, which makes them completely unviable in the UK. The other thing that's really problematic about them, and also everyone realises this, is they make the situation on either side of the defence worse. Yeah? So the energy of the ocean comes, but it has to go somewhere. And they don't absorb the energy, they just deflect it up and down the coast. And so it actually accelerates coastal erosion on either side, which causes all kinds of issues politically for those communities. This is another example of defend the line. This is a large-scale sand deposition in Bacton in Norfolk, where the shoreline is retreating 4 meters a year, and it's primarily designed to protect the Bacton gas terminal. And so if you're going to invest £5,000 a metre to protect the shore, normally it's around critical infrastructure, at least in the UK. A second approach is do nothing, or what is formally described as no active intervention. This is a picture of Fairbourne in Wales, which you've probably heard about. It's a town of about 1,000 people that will become the first decommissioned town in the UK as a consequence of climate change. It will be decommissioned by 2054. When that was announced, and many of the residents indeed learnt of it from the BBC. Property prices collapsed to almost zero overnight. And harking back to Indy's excellent presentation at the beginning, of course, these places are uninsurable, you can't get mortgages on them, etc. Residents are also liable for demolition costs. So alongside defend the line and no active intervention are a series of other approaches. Managed realignment is where new intertidal areas are created and they absorb sea energy, but they also have the benefit of creating buffer zones and new intertidal spaces, wetlands and marshes that are also good habitat for wildlife. Difficult to do because of the land consolidation requirements. Adaptive release, where we acknowledge the inevitability of eventual erosion, but conceptualize it as an occasion for documentation, education, and interpretation around loss, as in Hurst Castle, which after many years is being allowed to collapse into the sea. So this is kind of palliative care for the coast. It's letting it die well. Rollback, where we either move buildings if they're considered valuable enough to merit the expense, such as this lighthouse in East Sussex, which is now installed on rails, which allow them to move the building back from the coastline every 15 years. And you ask why they wouldn't just move it further inland, but it's a lighthouse, so it has to be near the coast. Because I asked that question. Obviously it's not a feasible strategy. And of course, rollback can also mean things like demolishing buildings on the shoreline and relocating residents, as in this Pathfinder project, where a total of 11 properties in Norfolk were acquired by the local authority at 45% of market price. The properties were then demolished. Council built them replacement properties, but none of the residents were in a financial position to purchase them. So in England, there are about 100,000 properties at risk in the next 50 years without any national strategy or viable process in place for adaptation or financial support, with a cost estimated to reach around 100 billion by 2100. There are some really encouraging examples internationally. Fiji is often cited. Someone referred to it as the poster child of managed relocation the other day, which I think is really apt. Their standard operating procedure for planned relocation focuses on cultural requirements, livelihoods, things like clan relationships. So it's been much more successful. Managed retreat in the UK is currently dominated by a quantitative understanding of value. And so our research on the Holderness coast in East Riding of Yorkshire tried to address that imbalance, and we wanted to try to foreground more qualitative understandings and perceptions of value, loss, and damage. So this is the workshop. And it's important that some of the conversations with this community took place on the coast, along the shoreline, within their own spaces and within their own at-risk areas. Situating the discussions in that way helped us to convey to participants that their knowledge is valuable, it better positions them as experts, and it supports a sense of familiarity. It also encourages really directly referential, descriptions of experience in relationship to place, which as architects was very valuable to us. When we asked them what they valued and what they would most like to keep about the area, residents almost always referred to social ties and social bonds. And there was an incredible density of hobby and activity groups, which I found very beautiful. So they had reading and sewing groups, photography clubs, knit and natter clubs, pantomime clubs, swimming groups, ceilidh band, choir and music band, tennis clubs, bulls, rummy club, and dancing. In nearly all of the references to community activities or groups, the date of said group was also mentioned. So, Hornsey Harriers running group is on every Sunday. At the Methodist Church, it's tap dancing on Tuesdays, and on Thursdays, it's dancercise. And that became a really prominent theme, and it was something we became very attentive to. And it's not that rhythm was somehow important to the community. In some way, that rhythm was the community. It was what constituted their ability to create a lived territory. Routine spoke to the spatial organisation of the town and the importance of this promenade as the connecting civic space. It works as a kind of forum, a civic centre, a space for exercise. And the buildings were important, but they weren't really that important from a kind of conventional architectural perspective. They were important because they allowed a flexibility of use. So if you think about the relationship between those three things, the density of clubs, organisations and associations, the rhythm of shared routines across the week, and the flexibility of communal spaces able to accommodate different kinds of functions connected by that promenade, and you get quite close to what this community means to save in the transition that lies ahead. So where we might have expected to encounter fear and uncertainty about the future, we found acceptance, and climate change, or at least coastal erosion, has been happening here for millennia, and climate change is merely accelerating it. And we expected if we were to look at a different community, we would end up with very, very different results, and so that's actually the point of the work. In the next and third phase, we're going to expand the project to compare different at-risk coastal communities around the world. We're going to look at the Nile Delta in a next case study, and then hopefully adding Durban, the Bengal Delta, and a Pacific island shortly thereafter, funding dependent. The kinds of questions we want to answer are, what do at-risk coastal communities share in terms of the things they want to record, preserve, or take with them? What are the things they're prepared to leave behind? What kinds of things are they prepared to put an economic figure next to? And how should we calculate it? But also, what kinds of things exceed monetary value? And these are all really crucial questions, and it's our intention that Second Sea becomes a kind of platform to share those stories by bringing global scale modeling of loss and damage into contact with local scale experiences of climate change. As it evolves, Second Sea aims to support these struggles by creating new kinds of exchange and solidarity between these at-risk communities, alliances organized around shared risk and challenge, but also working collectively towards reparative justice. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. And the details of the project are just here if you want to follow.